Simon was stunned into silence. He sat down on the bed in shock, unable to believe that Lacan had died 500 years ago, and that he himself had been reincarnated as Lacan's descendant 500 years into the future. For a moment, he was speechless, then abruptly ran away, shocking the butler. The butler shouted that he shouldn't be moving around so much in his condition, but he didn't listen. He rushed to the balcony door, his mind racing with disbelief, wondering if they truly expected him to believe such a story, and if they took him for a fool. None of it made sense. He grabbed the door handle and flung it open, shouting in frustration that it simply didn't make sense. But he froze in shock when he saw a massive suit of armor standing before him. Staring at it, he wondered what it was. Deep down, he realized that if it existed, it confirmed that everything the butler had said was true. He studied the machine, noting that it was far more advanced than the golem magic he knew. A weapon of such sophistication one had only imagined stood right in front of him. The butler called out to him in concern, but he ignored him and instead asked for his name. The butler introduced himself as Hans, his personal servant. Simon then asked Hans what the machine was, and Hans explained that it was called a Gigant, a bipedal humanoid weapon. Simon asked if it was created using golem magic, and Hans replied that he was partly correct. A Gigant, Hans explained, was made through a combination of scientific hextech and magic. Due to technological advancements, unlike golems, which were controlled remotely, Gigants were piloted directly by individuals inside them. Simon asked Hans to confirm that people actually went inside the machines, and Hans simply nodded. Simon realized how much advanced technology must have gone into creating such weapons. If Hans was telling the truth, Gigants were incredible, capable of ensuring safety from external threats and reacting far more quickly than remotely controlled golems. He also noted that Gigants addressed all the problems he had faced with golems in his time. Walking around the room, Simon appeared lost in thought, confusing Hans. Eventually, he returned indoors and stopped abruptly. If such technology existed, it could only mean one thing: 500 years had indeed passed. He stared at his hands, bitterly wondering why he had been reborn as a descendant of his sworn enemy. A moment later, Hans shouted his name in alarm. Simon was drinking alcohol. Hans rushed toward him, worriedly urging him to calm down and take care of himself. Simon looked at Hans with a cold expression and asked if it was true that he was a descendant of Lacan. Hans confirmed it. Simon then asked why, if he was supposedly a descendant of the great hero, he felt such pain. Doubling over in agony, he clutched the table and cursed, demanding to know what was happening. Hans, deeply worried, admitted that he had tried to warn Simon and explained that it was the curse. Simon froze and asked Hans what he meant by a curse. Hans sighed, realizing that Simon truly had no memory of it. Hans began to recount the story of Lacan's battle against the demon lord, but Simon impatiently told him to skip to the point. Hans explained that, although Lacan had been praised for saving the world, he had died young due to the demon lord's curse. Simon's mind reeled. Could it really be true? He suddenly remembered the moment he had cursed Lacan, saying that his entire bloodline should suffer for eternity. He slapped his forehead in frustration, realizing it was something he had said in anger because he was furious at the time. 500 years ago, the world had faced a catastrophic threat: the demon lord. The demon lord's dark magic could summon golems far stronger than any army. Countless soldiers were wiped out with a flick of his hand. The world had seemed doomed, but thanks to the righteous warrior Lacan, peace was restored. However, before the demon lord was defeated, he cast a curse upon Lacan and his descendants, ensuring they would all die painful deaths at a young age. Simon closed the book he was reading, anger boiling inside him. He muttered that they had spun the story however they wanted. He knew he hadn't even cast a proper curse in the first place. Did people really believe a curse could last for 500 years? He sighed, deciding not to dwell on it. It was his fault for losing. Simon let out a bitter sigh, wondering why he had been reborn as his enemy's descendant. It felt as though he was the one truly cursed. He pulled another book from the shelf and sat down, thinking deeply. He realized this was his second chance, a chance to accomplish what he couldn't in his previous life. He couldn't face Katerina if he didn't take this opportunity. He thought about the world, which had remained rotten for another 500 years. If anything, it was likely more corrupt now. However, Simon felt certain that not all of his followers could have been wiped out. He resolved to learn as much as he could about this era. If he could reunite with his followers, he swore he would change the world this time. The next day, he was still in the library. Frustrated, he threw a book on the ground and alcohol. He cursed his followers, enraged by the realization that people had almost completely forgotten about the demon lord. He stood up, muttering that it was too much, even if 500 years had passed, and lamented there wasn't even a trace of his existence left. Feeling dizzy, he acknowledged that his current body lacked both mana and stamina, leaving him to wonder what he could even do in this state. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his ankle, causing him to trip and slam his head on the floor. Sighing in frustration, he asked himself what he should do now. As he clenched his fists, his thoughts turned to Katarina. Sadly, he asked if he had been doomed to achieve nothing in life. And he lamented that all he had wanted was to create a world where everyone was equal in content. Suddenly, he heard someone loudly calling his name from outside. Confused, he peeked through the window, wondering what the commotion was about. A man was shouting, demanding to know how much longer he intended to avoid them. The man declared that they, the merchants, wouldn't take a single step back until they had an audience with the young master. The man introduced himself as Darren, the branch master of the ALA Merchant Association. Simon chuckled bitterly, realizing Lakin's descendant must have it rough, and wondered if he was in debt. Darren shouted that the young master owed them 30,000 pesos, borrowed the previous year to develop a mine. He accused the young master of avoiding repayment ever since, and demanded to know if they even intended to pay it back, adding that he couldn't live like this anymore. Hans appeared and tried to defuse the situation, telling Darren that the young master was unwell and needed rest, but promising they would find a way to pay him back. Hans asked Darren to come back another time. Darren, however, firmly refused and insisted that he needed to hear directly from the young master on the matter. His words silenced everyone. Darren then suggested that, based on their reaction, they didn't have the means to pay back the debt right now. He offered them an alternative hand over the gigant in their possession. He noted that the gigant, being second-hand, probably wasn't worth the full 30,000 pesos, and claimed he was giving them a generous offer. The Knight Commander, Roger, shouted that such a thing was impossible. Roger angrily added that they only had 3 gigants in the entire household, and demanded to know how they were supposed to defend their territory without them. He declared that he would rather die than allow them to take the gigants, as they were crucial to their defense. Hans tried to calm Roger, assuring him that it wouldn't happen. The accountant, Dixon, then suggested raising taxes temporarily instead of taking the deal. Hans, furious, asked Dixon if he had any idea how the people were faring. Hans shouted that they couldn't burden the few people they had left with higher taxes. Dixon, stammering, responded that the only viable option was to hand over the gigant. This made Roger livid, and he shouted again that it was out of the question. Simon listened to the servants argue about what to do, laughing to himself. He found it ironic and amusing, thinking that it was a great household and that Lacan should have seen it. Darren interrupted the argument, asking everyone to relax. He admitted that, personally, he wanted to seize the gigant and the manor. However, he said he didn't want people to think of them as the kind of merchants who would take from the house of the great hero. Then, with a calm demeanor, Darren pointed in the direction of the gigant. Roger, seething with anger, asked if Darren was joking and demanded to know how many times he had to say that they couldn't give up the gigant. But Darren smiled and clarified that he wasn't pointing at the gigant. Instead, he was pointing at the magic tower behind it. Everyone froze in shock. Roger, breaking the silence, admitted that the magic tower might be a better choice than the gigant, to which Hans reluctantly agreed, noting that no one ever used the tower anymore. Dixon chimed in, saying that the tower had once generated some income as a tourist attraction, but had since become useless. He added that some people even believed the tower was the source of the curse. Simon's expression darkened as he listened. He cursed Lacan under his breath, furious at the revelation. That magic tower was his, and he couldn't believe that Lacan had built his manor right on the spot where he had defeated him. 500 years ago, where the Demon King's tower now stood, Simon's home had been far away from that place. It was an old and worn-down house, but it was there as a cozy resting place where he and Katarina had dreamed of a better future together. So, when Simon heard Darren mention that the land around the Demon Tower had crossed into the territory of their company, he was furious. How dare they go after that place? Darren laughed, telling his servant not to worry too much. With their company's diverse capabilities, he said, they would be able to turn it into a popular tourist spot while greatly enhancing the local economy. Hans and Roger remained silent, deep in thought, while Dixon eagerly asked Darren where he should sign. However, their conversation was interrupted by an overwhelming presence. They turned to see Simon storming out of the estate, his anger palpable. Hans rushed toward him, asking if it was all right for him to be walking in his condition, but Simon curtly ordered them to step aside. Darren greeted him with a sly grin, saying it had been hard to secure a meeting with him. He asked if Simon had already recovered and explained that the talks with his vassals were going well. All that remained was Simon's signature to finalize their company's management of the Demon Tower, but Simon cut him off, coldly asking if all Darren knew how to do was talk. Darren, confused, asked what he meant, but Simon pressed further, demanding to know if Darren even understood what kind of place the Demon Tower was, and how he dared to try to take control of it. Darren and his knights began to tremble, unsettled by Simon's fierce demeanor. This was not the man they had heard about. Darren hesitated but then tried to save face, telling Simon that their company had been considerate of his situation. However, if Simon continued speaking in such a manner, they would withdraw their proposal. Simon scoffed and called Darren a con man, telling him to zip it. He stated plainly that he knew their true intentions after taking the land that stood at the center of their territory, near the main estate. They would use the guise of development and tourism to expand their influence and authority. He then demanded to know if he had gotten anything wrong. Darren, shocked, stammered that Simon's accusations were far-fetched, but Simon dismissed him, accusing their company of being so pathetic that they couldn't even sell second-hand weapons. He added that their latest attempt to take over the territory was a step too far. Simon declared that while he despised incompetence, what he hated even more were people who were utterly evil on the inside. Panicking, Darren realized he couldn't let Simon gain the upper hand. Summoning his resolve, Darren shouted back that the Lacan household was unable to repay its debt, which was why they had come up with such a considerate proposition. He argued that the company needed to recover its money somehow. Simon's eyes narrowed. He angrily asked who said they weren't repaying their debt and then declared that in 10 days they would repay everything, including the interest. He ordered Darren and his men to leave immediately. Releasing a powerful aura, he left them stunned and paralyzed with fear. Darren hiccuped in panic, hastily retreating with his knights. As they drove off, Darren shouted that they would see if Simon could truly stand by his words. Fuming, Simon muttered to himself that men like Darren all acted the same. Behind him, Roger called out, shouting in disbelief at what Simon had just said to Darren. Simon turned in confusion, asking what Roger meant. To his surprise, all of his vassals placed their hands on their chests as a sign of their pledge and shouted that they were deeply touched by his words. Hans, brimming with excitement, praised Simon for his insight, saying he had seen through all of Darren's plans. Roger added that Simon's anger to protect their ancestors' accomplishments and honor was inspiring. Simon blinked, baffled, and asked what on earth they were talking about. Roger simply smiled and told Simon that he hadn't realized how much pride he took in the household's honor. He remarked on how Darren, the merchant bastard, had been completely cowed by Simon's fierce response. Roger concluded that, in that moment, he saw the image of their ancestor, the great hero Lacan and Simon. He was furious, thinking that those incompetent fools were trying to turn him into the Demon King again. But he took a deep breath, calming himself when Hans approached and asked how he intended to repay the debt. He countered by asking Hans how much 30,000 pesos was worth. Hans replied that it could buy 10,000 sacks of wheat, or a single unit of the new warrior-class Juggant. Hans added that they didn't have enough collateral to borrow money from a bank or other merchants and asked if he had any other solutions. Simon dismissed Hans's suggestions as unhelpful and told him to step aside, declaring that he would repay the debt in his own way. He instructed Hans to stay put and watch as he made his way back to the mansion. A short while later, he began inspecting the household's assets, facilities, and food supplies, only to find them completely depleted. Frustrated, he threw the paperwork to the floor and angrily asked Hans if this wasn't the household that had killed the Demon King. Why was there nothing left? Had someone stolen it all? Hans, visibly shaken, assured him that nothing had been stolen and begged him not to say such things. Hans explained that he would understand if he looked at the genealogy. Simon dismissed the idea, asking if Hans seriously thought he would look at something like that. Hans continued, explaining that after hero Lycon killed the Demon King, he was bestowed the title of Marquis, along with a large southern territory in the Livia Kingdom. Simon responded, "So what?" Hans went on to explain that Duke Baroque later incited a rebellion against the kingdom, and Lycan, unable to stand the injustice, fought against him. However, under the Demon King's curse, Lycan suffered a crushing defeat. After the rebellion, Lycan's title was revoked and he was exiled to the borders of the kingdom. where he eventually passed away due to the rapid deterioration of his health. Simon realized that Lakan hadn't chosen to establish his estate there intentionally. Simon remarked that the household's financial situation was so dire that it was a wonder how it had managed to survive for 500 years. He asked Hans how things had ended up this way. Hans sighed deeply, replying that it was due to their ancestors, who had clung to the hope of regaining the household's former glory. Simon asked what Hans meant by that. Hans explained that, for the sake of making a comeback, his ancestors had been willing to do anything, even if it meant using up all their assets, authority, and resources. Hans continued, saying that his ancestors had desperately wanted to recover the reputation of the household. However, due to the generational curse passed down through the family, no matter how hard they worked, their efforts had always been in vain. This, he said, was how the household, once home to the hero who saved the world, had fallen into ruin. Hans then hesitated, but added that he wasn't sure if he explained that the reason Simon had been unconscious for more than half a month was due to the gigant incident. Simon had worked tirelessly to restore the household's reputation, trying to prove that he had the qualities of a hero. But he had pushed himself too hard, ultimately collapsing from exhaustion. Simon was speechless upon hearing this. Slowly, he rose from his chair and walked to the window. Staring outside, he quietly told Hans that given their current situation, there didn't seem to be anything they could do. Hans, filled with regret, replied sadly that, even as the butler of the household, there was nothing he could do to help. He apologized sincerely. As Simon continued looking outside, Hans tried to comfort him, saying that he was sure there must be something they could do. Hans added that, even if it cost him his life, he would find a way to raise the total amount needed to save the household. Simon turned to Hans with a faint smile and reassured him that it wouldn't be necessary, he had just thought of something. Hans looked at him, confused. Simon then asked Hans seriously if it was true that they just needed to pay the money back somehow. Hans felt a sinking sensation, suspecting that something was about to go terribly wrong. The next day, Hans, along with the other household members, stood frozen in disbelief. Roger, with tears streaming down his face, demanded to know how it could have happened. Hans's thoughts raced. When the young master had said they would repay the money somehow, he hadn't imagined he meant selling the statue of hero Lakan. No one could believe it. The statue, the very pillar of their household, was gone. That's all for today, guys. See you on the next upload.